Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, good morning and welcome to Wednesday's edition of the podcast from Sky News and Politico that gives you everything that you need about the day ahead in British politics in under 20 minutes and then throws the pen in the crowd. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News and with me again is Anne McElvoy of Politico. Good morning, Anne.
Good morning, Sam. Bit warmer maybe where you are. It's -6 out here in Davos on Tuesday, January the 21st. I stuck my nose out a bit earlier just to get ready for this podcast and get the blood pumping, but then I scuttled back inside pretty fast.
Everybody, it seems, the conventional wisdom is to beat up on Davos if you're back behind in Westminster. But it is a great place to see people. It is a great place to connect both with businesses and with politicians out of the glare of most of the media and the spotlight. So I hope you're having a productive and fruitful time seeing important people, Anne.
Well, I'm basically bumping into as many of the senior Treasury team as I probably would in about a week walking around in Westminster or Whitehall. At least this is my defence of taking this week out in the Swiss Alps. This is what I tell my bosses. Let's not tell them any different.
Listen, there's a huge amount going on in Britain and around the world today and the stuff going on in America has sort of pretty big consequences for the UK. Donald 2.0, well, he's abandoned the $300 billion green investment plan that will once do inspiration for Edmund Aband and Rachel Reeves. Watch out, Jack, remember him? The new president is threatening steep rises in the taxes of overseas nationals working in the US. That sounds painful. Meanwhile, while two cabinet ministers have been preaching in the last 24 hours the value of AI in helping the UK government, Donald Trump announced $500 million of investment, private sector investment, in AI himself, rather upping the pace on that.
And back home, there's Prime Minister's questions that will no doubt take us to the Southport murders, which will continue to dominate the headlines with sentencing, the CPS laying out their case tomorrow. And more on that unfolding in a bit.
But I think to our main story this morning, and across government, I think, Anne, wherever you look, all the signs point to one big thing motoring this government along all of a sudden. And this has only really been true in the last week or so and really surfaced in the last couple of days. And that is there are lots and lots of indicators that Rachel Reeves has launched a massive fight back. I mean, let's be honest, it's been a pretty ropey start to the year for her. Most notably because the bond markets, the cost of borrowing has been going in the wrong direction. And there have been accusations all over the place that there hasn't really been a plan for growth in this government. Suddenly, there are multiple plans for growth, lots of movement everywhere as the government try and kickstart lots of different things. Most of these plans can be traced back to the Treasury and to Horse Guards Parade, or, for instance, today, given the Chancellor was actually in Davos, to Switzerland, where you are, Anne.
Yes, and Rachel Reeves out and about early this morning on her breakfast rounds. She's really trying to show how much contact she has and get convincing conversations going and get that message out there in Davos that Britain is investable. She'll be seeing Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan. He's like one of the biggest beasts in the Davos jungle. People tend to flock to where he is. So that's quite a good access for her. And David Solomon of Goldman Sachs and 100 CEOs at an event that Google is hosting. That seems to be really why she came. It's not just to schmooze, it's to be alongside those people who have spend.
There's a bit of a trend, Anne, and that is that whenever we hear from Rachel Reeves going on trips like she did to China, or here she is in Davos at the moment, she seems to spend a lot of time with finance people and tech people. And I just get the impression she spends less time with manufacturers and the kind of industries that maybe the trade unions would like her to sort of spend a bit more time looking after. Do you agree with that trend? And do you think it's a bit of a problem?
I think that is probably what a lot of people in industry, in the old sense of the word, if you like, think. Yeah, I think you're onto something there, and it may be something she has to turn back to. But look, from Rachel Reeves's point of view, you go where the money is, you go where the investment is right now, and where she sees it is in investment in the UK, perhaps by the city, financial services. She wants to show she's a big deregulator. She's sending that message quite insistently in the decisions that she's making, not least with the competition authority, etc. And tech, yes, she seems to be all in on tech. Davos is all in on tech and investment this year. So she is in that. Now, I do think one thing that it brings up is, where is she then in overall jobs? And the Office for National Statistics has just this morning dropped its latest borrowing and debt stats. And they're a bit less cheery than the upbeat message that she is portraying here in Switzerland, Sam, because they're showing a drop of 47,000 in payrolled employees. And it's just raising that issue that maybe, if you like, trad jobs may not be thriving as well as she might hope. But she's hoping, I think, to put rocket boosters on the economy by different routes, via the city and via the tech titans.
Well, there's a big focus this morning on firing up the growth quattro. And I think we can see her starting to show her hand and make her moves in order to try and get Britain moving again. And I think the big essay question for Rachel Reeves right now, as we hear the direction of travel in multiple different plans that seem to be emanating from the Treasury, is she about to take on too many enemies at once? Now, everywhere I look, there are bold moves and bold moves that will come with a backlash. So just look at the fights that she and Keir Starmer seem to be wanting to pick this week alone. Right, top of the list. We'll come back to this one. But a third runway at Heathrow, which of course was something that Labour long campaigned against, although not Rachel Reeves. There are new rules for nature and habitat, which I'm very fascinated by. These are often blamed for hampering growth, but there's quite a smart plan coming out of I think it's more out of Ed Miliband and Steve Reed in order to try and just square the circle between protecting nature and building a lot, but there will be opposition from environmental groups. Then you mentioned this sort of shock news overnight, which was the government, Treasury, I think a bit more Johnny Reynolds, the business secretary, has sacked the head of the Competition and Markets Authority. Now, fascinatingly, the letter suggests that he's not pro-growth enough, the ex-chair, the outgoing chair. One could say that he's being blamed for being too pro-competition because they're two sides of the same coin. And this is a biggie, but it won't get a lot of coverage. The Treasury is going to intervene in an obscure court case in the Supreme Court, which is all about one of these jumbo compensation schemes for motorists who think they were missold motor finance. Now, everyone's familiar with the PPI scandal, which cost the British economy and cost banks about 50 billion. Well, it looks as if this could happen in the motor industry sector. And Rachel Reeves, the Treasury, is intervening on that, but not on the side of the consumer, on the side of the banks, who could otherwise face quite a big hit if the legal process otherwise is allowed to take their course. So all of these fights are the kind of thing that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves sort of suggested and signalled that they do, and suddenly they're on our doorstep, and they've got the parliamentary majority to fight them. But there is just going to be a fascinating test: is whether or not they've got the stomach to push it through, despite the squealing and using that majority to do it, or are these plans going to actually end up maybe being watering down, maybe some of them die in a ditch, like so many of these things in the past. So I suppose the question is, Anne, is the -6 of Davos actually going to be a warmer place for her than maybe even the cabinet table over the coming weeks?
I think because of a lot of fights that are being picked as you describe, and this is a moment really for Rachel Reeves when her relations with many of her cabinet colleagues, including Ed Miliband there, who's been so on the front foot on the environment. If you like, Ed Miliband controls the world of those COP summits and Britain's environmental and climate change profile. But quite a lot of this, including what we're going to talk about, airports, but other things as well, do seem to sort of pull against that agenda. And a lot of other cabinet ministers and other ministers will be wondering whether the sort of Rachel Reeves that they supported because she was going to get their vision of what the UK economy should be up and running and that Quattro fired up. If they find out that the Quattro is running in a different direction, more in the interests of the banks, of the city, of deregulation. We're going to hear from left-wing economists. We'll hear them around Davos. I'm sure we'll hear them in the UK, and not only on the far left, saying, be careful with this deregulation thing. That can go wrong. That can go too far. She could find she actually gets a warmer reception here among the titans of finance than she gets among previously solid Labour colleagues. That's one to watch, I think.
So I think the big fight, though, that was kicked off with a Bloomberg report 36 hours ago is over the likely attempt by Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves to push ahead with a third runway at Heathrow. It's not the first time we've heard this plan. 2003. And do you know what happened that year? That's the year that Tony Blair had an aviation white paper making clear that Heathrow was the preferred location for a third runway. And this has been a story that is sort of threaded through my entire time covering Westminster. British politics has just gone hot and cold and hot and cold on this story and on this idea ever since. And now it seems to be back on, but only from reports, nothing formally confirmed. Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, at an event I was at last night, calling it speculation. But why is this issue so difficult for British politics, Anne?
Well, the advantage of having someone in their midlife with you on the podcast is that I remember this very well the last time that row started in 2003, because I was on the Evening Standard on the London paper, and it was an absolutely huge spat. It split a lot of opinion around Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And of course, those West London seats under the flight path and around, well, that pushed a lot of votes to the Lib Dems, so that there are party political implications. And perhaps most of all, it drags in the mayoralty. There's often a strong and quite often contrary view in the mayoralty about this. And under Sadiq Khan, definitely, because there's an opposition, I think, emerging there. He is already saying in the London Assembly that he will theoretically fight any runway expansion if stringent climate targets aren't met. And the one thing I think both you and I remember, Sam, is you then end up in a big argument about the criteria of how that is being measured, and is it being fudged, and is it stringent enough? If you want the runways built, as the Chancellor and I think the Prime Minister does, well, you tend to take a lighter touch on that. But if you're on the other side, you can find plenty of evidence that prolongs the rows and makes it difficult. So airport wars definitely back on.
If this was a straight virility test, a straight political virility test, the 170-odd Labour majority should mean that there's no problem with this. But as we have seen, as you have said, it is not just about politics. There are very, very complicated legal processes that have to be gone through in order to make this happen, which is one of the reasons it's failed in the past. Not least, how do they square these plans with carbon budgets? In other words, the commitment to reduce carbon emissions that the government have signed up to. And then there's the question of exactly which version of a third runway the government signs up to and who has to pay the price in terms of communities in West London. It is not the case that there is simply one blueprint that you can press a button on and this happens. And the timescale that you're looking at tends to be around 10 to 15 years from the moment a decision is actually made before flights actually start coming in and out. So this is a fight over growth that Rachel Reeves isn't going to benefit from in terms of hard cash coming into her exchequer, yet it looks like it's a fight that she wants to pick. So good luck with that.
I think there is a reason for it, though. I know that does sound right, doesn't it? It's like, why are you going through all of this? It's so far down the line that you capture the gains. But let's link it up, Sam, to that visit to China. It's very, very important to Beijing that London has links between what they call the second-tier Chinese cities, on which China is also relying for its growth. It's also, everybody's got a growth problem, have you noticed? So yes, it may be that the actual flights coming in and out, that could be way down the line. Who knows what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer will be up to then. But in the meantime, it is sending the signals that she wants to send to potential investors into the UK, aka China and others, that she's prepared to go into this fight. She's prepared to fall out with some of the environmental wing of her own party and others for other reasons who just don't like the airport expansions, in order to show that she's serious about that kind of attraction. It's a courtship with the international global investment community, or at least I would see it that way.
You mentioned there environmental objections. One of the things this government is looking at doing is changing the rules around how projects, mega projects that the government is in favour of, that are built by the private sector and the public sector, try and deal with all of those nature and habitat rules that planners and builders often say gum up the system. Now, Steve Reed and Ed Miliband have come up with quite an innovative plan, basically to create a central pot to fund nature and habitat programs, so that individual buildings, development, rail projects and the like aren't responsible for every last bit of adhering to every last bit of every last nature rule, and they can find other ways in order to satisfy the various regulations and laws. This is going to be highly, highly contentious. It's theoretically going to be part of one of Angela Rayner's planning bills later in the year. Very, very senior people in the nature world are in favour of these changes, but there's still likely to be a bit of a backlash from environmental groups over it. And again, this is another thing which will be a litmus test of how robust this government is in its drive for growth and ability to stand up to not just vested interests, but bits of an environmental movement that think they're basically part of the Labour Party.
Right. Well, we need to turn to Southport with sentencing coming tomorrow. This is obviously also big political row that is going to keep going on the backdrop to that, and particularly the failure to call this a terror incident from late July through to October. Details were revealed when Axel Rudakubana was charged in October, but in that time and in the weeks and months since, there's been that fizzing story that has been coming out often through opponents of the government, but concern, I think, also in Labour about the way that the information was handled. Sam?
So you've got a concerted attempt by Keir Starmer, who I think basically sniffs danger in relation to this story, to get on top of it. That's why you had the 15-minute statement yesterday. But there are still lots of bits of rows trickling through the papers, and it's not going to go away because the story will keep going tomorrow. You have that question over whether or not the authorities should have acknowledged it was a terror incident. Some of the police actively claiming it wasn't at one point. You've got the row over whether or not Keir Starmer could have linked the incident to terror. He claims that he couldn't under contempt of court rules, and he didn't want to prejudice trials, but Reform in particular are suggesting that he did exactly, the Prime Minister has done exactly that in past court cases. But one of the most interesting things for me is just the way that Keir Starmer sought to widen out what Rudakubana did to suggest that it was the sort of consequence, or in part the consequence, of a sort of unhappy and broken society. At that press conference yesterday, he said, he sort of pointed a dotted line to children who've stopped going to school since the pandemic, young people who've opted out of work or education, more and more people retreating into parallel lives, whether through the failures of integration or just a country slowly turning away from itself. It was a very bleak picture painted by the Prime Minister. I suppose the question that we'll be asking maybe in 2-3 years' time is to what extent has he been able to upend the social ills that he is appearing to link to what happened in Southport?
The only question I thought that threw up, and which continues, I think, in the coverage today, is that a reflection, or is it also a bit of a deflection? Because if this dreadful case and the shock people still feel in misery, people feel about it, is kind of pinned on broader societal, we're in a bit of a state with ourselves since the pandemic, that slightly clashes with what I think is obviously going to become more of a challenge for the government, which is, what did you know and when did you know it? And was there a desire, not a cover up perhaps as the full frontal foes of the government are suggesting, but just a desire to kind of lean out from the idea that this was a real big failing of integration, of being the anti-terror laws not really working in practice, the Prevent program, that stuff which in the state is the state not working. It's not just people being miserable and disaffected. There'd be an awful lot of a mix of those things. The other thing that the Prime Minister was talking about was how easily it was for Rudakubana to access a very sharp-bladed knife, and he calls it the two-click killer because it was ordered via Amazon. So actually the Prime Minister's picking a bit of a fight with Amazon there on how easily this young man was able to order the murder weapon off the internet. This cannot continue, Keir Starmer said, which implies that he has something up his sleeve that he wants to ask Amazon for in terms of constraint on selling knives online. Interesting.
And we are learning this morning that ministers are planning to introduce a 2-step process to buy knives online, where you first of all have to produce documentation to prove you're over 18, and then you might have to use a webcam to do a sort of live selfie video before you're allowed to do that. Anyway, we've bust over our 20-minute limit, and so we've got to leave it there. Good luck with Davos, Anne, and I will speak to you very soon.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.